The early years of the Cold War were a fascinating time for aviation. A myriad of new technologies were fundamentally changing how combat aircraft were being designed: the jet engine, airborne radar, and guided air-to-air missiles. In a few decades, these would become the cornerstones of military aircraft. But immediately after the end of the Second World War, aircraft designers were scrambling to understand how best to first employ these systems. This led to the creation of some highly unique designs. Some would be successful, and they would birth dynasties of fighters that would fly on for decades. Others would be missteps in this new age, but would lead to valuable lessons about what did, and more importantly, what did not work. And then there was a third category: sound, brilliant concepts that would have flourished beautifully had they not been subjected to the unique torture of British Civil Service Committee wrangling, Treasury penny pinching, and a touching and yet entirely misplaced reliance on an embryonic weapons system. Today's topic is very much in that final, gloriously compromised category. Hello and welcome back. My name's Christopher Rex Elmden. I like to talk about planes a lot, and today I'm a little bit bruised because I decided to trip and fall into one of my bookshelves, but no matter. I also apologise for the slightly chaotic setup of the office right now. I'm in the middle of rejigging the entire desk setup, so there's no fancy YouTuber background going on at the moment, just a cloth draped over the massive window. Anyway, today we are talking about the de Havilland DH.110 Sea Vixen. If you were to stand on a pitching and rain-lashed flight deck of a Royal Navy aircraft carrier in the early 1960s, trying desperately not to get blown into the North Sea whilst you're doing so, you would have been greeted by one of the most structurally bizarre and imposing silhouettes of the jet age. But behind its majestic appearance lay a story of horrific tragedy, an 80% structural redesign, and a safety record so horrific that it claimed nearly 40% of all aircraft ever built. The Sea Vixen is a fascinating and also dark case study in early Cold War aircraft development. Few aircraft have a development history that is as painful, as tragic, and sometimes downright infuriating as that of the poor Sea Vixen. The aircraft that entered service was vastly different from the first design drawings, and indeed that of the first prototype. The original was a land-based RAF interceptor. The production model was a carrier-based aircraft. The original could achieve supersonic speeds. The production model couldn't. The original was designed with 4 30mm Aiden cannons. The production model wasn't. Indeed, it was the first British combat aircraft to enter service with no gun armament at all, relying entirely on missiles, rockets, and bombs. The original was meant to lead British aerial defence into a new, modern era. The production model spent most of its years playing a perpetual game of catch-up due to its protracted and severely delayed development. So, what actually went wrong? And how has such a troubled machine managed to keep itself alive in the hearts and minds of so many of us in the aviation community? Well, for starters, it is bloody cool, but there is of course a lot more to it than that. But before we talk about the history of the Sea Vixen in general, I want to talk about just one Sea Vixen in particular, and a very special museum project. So, with the power of editing, let us leave my musty and messy office and travel about 3 weeks into the past. Hi, I'm at the Queensland Air Museum, and behind me is a de Havilland Sea Vixen. Or at least, the cockpit of one. More specifically, this is the front section of Sea Vixen FAW Mark II XJ607. So,
why is there the front end of a Sea Vixen sitting in the middle of an aircraft museum hangar? Well, once upon a time, this travelled around the country on a trailer, serving as a sort of mobile educational exhibit. People could come in and sit in the cockpit like I am here and learn all about what is a truly fascinating aircraft. And it would also serve as a sort of advertisement for the museum itself. Unfortunately, that trailer that it was mounted on has reached the end of its useful life. Now, the Queensland Air Museum is a volunteer-run organisation, and it is financially supported by donations. They've struggled to fund a replacement trailer due to many other pressing projects and financial responsibilities. So, I'm going to fund it, ideally with your help. My goal is ideally to raise enough funds to build a brand new specialised trailer so that XJ607 can return to a life of touring as a mobile educational exhibit. The amount I need to raise to make this happen is $16,000 Australian. That will cover the cost of assessment and design and then fabrication of a new specialised trailer for the Sea Vixen cockpit. That is a fairly lofty goal. I'm really hoping that we can achieve it, and in the rare case that we're able to exceed it, any additional funds that get donated towards this fundraiser will go towards restoration and maintenance of the Sea Vixen cockpit, fixing the canopy slides for one, and also purchasing additional equipment that we will need when we take this thing on tour. And I say we because I volunteer at the museum, and even though I may soon be moving away from this lovely local area, I'm still going to be returning on a regular basis in my capacity as a volunteer. All right, so how do we actually get this thing funded? Well, it's very straightforward. I've set up a GoFundMe page on behalf of the museum. So you will just click on the link that is in the video description or down in the pinned comment below. You go to the page and you make your donation. It can be big or small. Every little bit will help. As I said before, this is a volunteer-run museum. They are funded purely by donations or by the occasional grants. So it really is up to us to get the Sea Vixen back on its trailer and traveling around as a mobile exhibit, and hopefully getting new, young, and enthusiastic people into the world of aviation that we all love to read and talk about every day.
Right, the fundraiser for the campaign is now live on GoFundMe. I've put a link down in the description and also in the pinned comment down below. If you can donate, big or small, every little bit helps, as I said just before. In fact, if just 1% of the channel's monthly audience was able to donate just $1 each, we would have more than enough to get this whole thing funded. So even if you can spare just $1, that's fine. It might be the dollar that gets this whole thing over the line. Now, XJ607 itself was a FAW2 variant, as I said. This was the main model of the Sea Vixen that saw service. And as I said before, it was vastly different from the originally intended design. Now, to understand how and why this change occurred, we of course need to start at the beginning. So, let's do that. The Sea Vixen's story begins at the end of the Second World War. Britain had emerged victorious, but the Royal Air Force and the Fleet Air Arm of the Royal Navy now faced a daunting challenge in this new post-war era. The emergence of the jet engine during the war made it clear that all existing piston engine fighters were rapidly becoming obsolete. Additionally, the war had also proven the tactical value of radar-equipped night fighters. Therefore, to maintain aerial superiority and to keep pace with rapid global aircraft developments, both services knew that they would have to fully embrace these new technologies. However, as mentioned before, nobody really knew the best way to do this yet. This is illustrated by the striking differences between Britain's first two operational jet fighters, the twin-engine, single-tail Gloucester Meteor, and the single-engine, twin-boom-tail de Havilland Vampire. It was the Vampire that first caught the attention of the Royal Navy, the eventual operator of the Sea Vixen. On the 3rd of December 1945, it became the first pure jet aircraft to land on and take off from an aircraft carrier, in the hands of legendary test pilots Captain Eric Winkle Brown. The Sea Vampire, the navalised version of the type, would soon become the Royal Navy's first operational jet aircraft. But even before the first squadrons were becoming operational, the Admiralty was already looking to the future. The Sea Vampire had not been initially developed with carrier use in mind. It had been navalised or modified for carrier use after the fact. The Navy wanted something designed specifically for their needs, and so in 1946 they began talking with de Havilland about the ideal aircraft that would meet these needs. Now, with jet engines being a new technology and still very much in their awkward teething phase, the Admiralty wanted an aircraft with 2 engines for redundancy in case one failed. In response to this, de Havilland started the initial design work on a new concept, taking early inspiration from the de Havilland Vampire. The official naval specification for this would be drawn up later on in 1947 as Specification N40/46. But despite the naval origins of the design's layout, the official government-funded origins of the Sea Vixen actually came from the Royal Air Force. The RAF was acutely aware that piston-engine fighters, directed by land-based radar networks, though a war-winning combination, would not guarantee protection against the new generation of high-speed, jet-powered bombers that were currently being developed. As a result, on January 24, 1947, the Air Ministry issued Specification F44/46, which called for a heavy, jet-powered, radar-equipped, 2-seat day and nighttime fighter with a planned top speed of at least 480 knots. As it so happened, the performance requirements of this specification were almost a mirror image of what the Royal Navy was looking for. Seeing this massive overlap, the design team at de Havilland's Hatfield factory made a logical, if incredibly ambitious move. They decided to submit a single basic twin-engine design to meet both specifications, giving it the company designation of DH.110. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find any verified drawings of the early original iterations of the 110, so for this period of the video, please forgive me whilst I use some later sketches of the de Havilland Sea Vixen just to provide an illustrative example. The heritage of the DH.110 at a glance was already unmistakable. Since the design of the Vampire back in 1943, de Havilland had remained deeply committed to the twin-boom tail layout, and in the context of early jet aircraft development, this made a lot of sense. If you didn't want wing-mounted engines, or if you only wanted one engine, you had to bury them deep in the fuselage. In a conventional layout, this meant running a long, heavy, and hot jet pipe all the way through to the end of the tail. That adds weight, and it would eat up the efficiency of the thrust through internal friction. By replacing the single tail with 2 separate tail booms bolted onto the wing center section, you greatly reduce the length of this exhaust pipe, which improves the engine's efficiency. But this wasn't the only reason why de Havilland went with this particular layout. Installing 2 engines side by side in the center of the fuselage made single engine control far less terrifying. If one engine died, the offset thrust forces wouldn't try to violently yaw the aircraft off to one side, which wouldn't be ideal if you were trying to land, say, on the deck of a moving aircraft carrier. It also made maintenance quite a bit easier. Instead of having to literally split a conventional fuselage in half to pull out an engine, which is inconvenient for most ground crews and practically impossible on a cramped, tossing hangar deck, mechanics could just open up some massive hatches below and on top of the engine and get straight to work. There were other benefits too. You would get improved roll performance owing to the tight center of mass, improved structural rigidity, and the twin booms also helped to damp out the effects of aerodynamic flutter, which were violent, self-excited structural vibrations which tended to plague early aircraft as they approached the sound barrier. Putting all those benefits aside though, the DH.110 wasn't just a bigger, heavier version of the Vampire. To reach the speeds that everyone was demanding, it needed to have a swept wing. British designers had spent the post-war years eagerly analysing captured German research, for they had been the ones leading the field on this at this time, and de Havilland was so fascinated by the idea of using swept wings to delay the onset of high-speed transonic drag that they actually built a dedicated research jet aircraft, which was the tailless de Havilland DH.108 Swallow. Now, those of you who remember from the time, I covered the Swallow in a video quite a few years ago, so I won't go into too much detail about it here. But in short, its test flights convinced the design team that a sweepback angle of between 45 to 40 degrees was the ideal sweet spot, giving supersonic speeds in a dive, while keeping acceptable handling at medium to lower speeds. However, the DH-108 also taught them some incredibly painful lessons. Being completely tailless, the aircraft suffered from a gradual and terrifying loss of longitudinal control as it slowed down, and it was prone to continuous and nauseating pitch oscillations in turbulent airflow. Because of its low-speed handling issues and some nasty high-speed devices, de Havilland not only kept the twin-boom tail for the DH-110, but also sought to improve it with a fully trim-adjustable horizontal tailplane. This could be adjusted in flight, and was intended to trim out the massive and violent airflow shifts that often occurred near supersonic speeds. While de Havilland was busy working on all of this, the Air Ministry was busy doing what it did best, and that was complicating things. In 1948, the Air Staff decided to rewrite its night fighter requirement into the incredibly demanding specification F4/48. What follows now is a condensed list of the original requirements. They wanted a top speed of at least 525 knots, which is about 972 kilometers per hour at 25,000 feet, plus an endurance of at least 2 hours. It was required to operate, find, and intercept aircraft in both nighttime and all-weather conditions. Crucially, the RAF wanted a rapid response interceptor that could scramble and catch high-altitude targets at a moment's notice. That meant going from a stone-cold engine start to 45,000 feet in just 10 minutes. Takeoff had to happen in under 1,500 yards to make sure that the aircraft could use existing airfields. They also demanded air brakes that could fully deploy in under 4 seconds, and a massive structural load limit of 4 Gs at sea level at maximum speeds. Then came the list of required equipment. To aid endurance, the ability to equip the aircraft with underwing drop tanks was considered a must, as was having a pressurized crew compartment supplemented by oxygen tanks that would allow at least 2.5 hours of operational use at high altitudes. Crew survivability was heavily prioritized. Either the entire crew cabin was to be able to be jettisoned, or each crew member was to receive their own ejection seats. In terms of operational critical equipment, the specification called for airborne interception radar, IFF transponders, multi-channel VHF radios for better communication, and the Rebecca navigation system. And although it wasn't mandatory in the specification, blind landing capability was strongly suggested. In terms of armament, they specified a potent array of 4 internally mounted 30mm Aden cannons, with enough ammunition for 15 seconds of continuous fire. Additionally, the cannons were to be aimed through a new gyroscopic gun sight that was to be integrated with the radar system. The aircraft also had to be capable of carrying unguided rockets and the new, in development, air-to-air guided missile. Never mind the fact that this later weapon was deep in the murk of a troubled development. Oh, and of course, the Air Ministry expected this incredibly complex machine to be cheap to produce, easy to produce, and manufactured at a rate of at least 10 aircraft per month. With this massive wish list in hand, de Havilland began detailed design work towards the middle of 1948. The quality of their proposal was to their credit, and it was enough to win a contract from the Ministry of Supply, who ordered 9 prototypes. 7 of these were night fighters, and 2 would be long-range variants designed under a separate specification. All that being said though, it might come as a surprise to learn that the DH-110 was not in fact the RAF's favourite choice. The Air Staff was secretly infatuated with the radical Delta-wing Gloucester GA-5, which would eventually become the Gloucester Javelin. They were treating the DH-110 primarily as an insurance policy, in case the Gloucester project hit issues and fell short of its design requirements. However, as the post-war economic situation of Britain began to rapidly unravel towards the end of the 40s, the Ministry of Supply quickly realised that buying 9 prototypes as a backup option was perhaps not really the most budget-friendly thing to do, and they cut the order down to 5. Instead, they pushed de Havilland to focus a lot more on the cheaper, simpler Venom design as a low-risk alternative. At pretty much the exact same time as this, the Navy was also having its own private panic about finances as well. They had briefly joined the party by ordering 4 navalized versions of the DH.110 prototype under specification N14/49, but naval officials started getting incredibly nervous about the plane's massive size and projected weight. On top of that, de Havilland itself was having a horrible time trying to design a folding wing mechanism that would allow the aircraft to fit onto the cramped lifts of the Navy's existing carrier decks. Fearing that the DH.110 would be both too expensive and too late, the Admiralty quickly scaled back its ambitions. They still needed new aircraft though, so as a quick and cheaper stopgap, and to stay in de Havilland's good books, they bought the smaller, single-engine de Havilland Sea Venom as an alternative, leaving the development of a new naval night fighter to Fairey Aviation, and they cancelled the development of the de Havilland navalised prototypes altogether. This left the RAF as the only potential customer, and their interest at this point was lukewarm at best. The Air Ministry then cut down the order yet again, leaving de Havilland with just 2 prototypes to be built at their factory at Hatfield. Interestingly enough, amid all of this political waffling and treasury cuts, de Havilland's chief designer, R.E. Bishop, issued a series of prophetic warnings that the military completely ignored. Back in November 1947, Bishop had argued passionately against the sudden trend of abandoning single-seat fighters in favour of the new, heavy, complicated two-seaters designed around a new experimental air-to-air missile system. The Ministry of Supply was already trying to tie the DH.110's combat systems to unproven weapons like the early developments of the Red Hawk missile and a bizarre 4.5-inch recoilless gun. Bishop warned that these advanced weapons wouldn't be ready for years, and that at the end of the day, an interception is a matter of raw aircraft performance first, and weaponry second. He begged the air staff to keep at least one modern single-seat fighter in development, and later on he was totally vindicated when the brilliant single-seat Hawker Hunter rushed into service, and towards a glowing career, while the missile-armed, all-weather interceptors dragged through near enough a decade of agonizing pain and delays. Now, despite Bishop's own philosophical objections, the work on the 2 DH.110 prototypes at Hatfield pressed ahead. The first machine, which was registered Whiskey Golf 236, was eventually finished in the summer of 1951. This first prototype was a beautifully striking aircraft with a bright silver paint scheme. It was completed with no guns and with no radar, but was instead stuffed full of flight testing equipment. It was also, for a fighter aircraft at least, quite large. It had a wingspan of 50 feet and a length of just over 52 feet, and its all-up weight was approximately 35,000 pounds, which, for comparison, isn't far off the empty weight of a 4-engined Avro Lancaster. Following tests with the troubled DH-108 Swallow, the wing sweep of the DH-110 was set to 40 degrees, down from 45. Given the stresses the airframe was expected to endure, all controls were fully powered, but something known as Q-feel or artificial feedback was installed to simulate aerodynamic forces through the control stick. This was added to avoid the pilots overstressing the control surfaces in extreme maneuvers by pulling too hard on the stick. Power was provided by the Rolls-Royce Avon RA7, the Avon being the company's first successfully running axial flow turbojet. Each of these generated approximately 7,500 pounds of static thrust. As in the original designs, these engines were placed side by side in the center rear of the fuselage, nestled neatly between the twin tail booms. Now, it was during the design and build phase of the first prototypes that de Havilland finalized one of the most visually distinct features of the aircraft, and that was the highly asymmetrical cockpit. If you stand head-on to a Sea Vixen, the pilot's bubble canopy is shoved completely off to the port side. To the starboard side of that bubble, the fuselage is flat, broken only by a flush metal hatch and a tiny rectangular window. Underneath that flat hatch, buried deep in the dark, pressurized belly of the fuselage, sat the radar observer. Good pilots get beautiful teardrop sliding canopies for which they can observe the world around them. Naughty radar operators get to go in the crate, and they will damn well like it. Flight crews would quickly dub this claustrophobic tomb as the coal hole. Now, there was a very real and practical reason for this layout. The cathode ray tubes on early Cold War radar sets were incredibly dim, and in the bright daylight, the operator needed pretty much total darkness just to see the faint green blips of a target on the radar screen. By burying the observer in a metal box, de Havilland avoided a bulky double canopy, which reduced the plane's cross-section and minimized high-speed drag, and it also aided in the operation of the radar in broad daylight. As displays later on evolved and got better, this issue was overcome, and operators were once again allowed to see the sun, but for now they would be flying in darkness. Although it is often known as a coal hole or as a flying tomb, I do need to point out that both the pilot and the poor radar operator would be given Martin Baker ejection seats, and don't worry, the metal hatch was ejected before the radar operator's seat fired. It was of course a very unorthodox layout, but it addressed a real problem that had to be overcome. Even so, some aerodynamicists like Roy Hofschneider did have concerns that this offset canopy could create a persistent yawing moment and a roll into yaw coupling during flight maneuvers, which would make the aircraft a fairly useless and unstable gun platform. But de Havilland was confident that their robust twin-fin tail would easily handle any aerodynamic weirdness. And, to their credit, they were correct. On September 26, 1951, de Havilland's chief test pilot, John Cunningham, climbed into the cockpit of Whiskey Golf 236 and took the prototype up for its maiden flight. After 46 minutes, which was quite a long time for a first flight test, he would return with glowing reports. He declared that the DH.110 would be a potential world beater. It had docile handling and performance that comfortably exceeded their pre-flight estimates. This trend continued with the early series of flight tests that immediately followed this, and they all yielded glowing results. The prototype was found to have remarkable performance, and its medium to high altitude maneuverability, courtesy of those power booster controls, utterly astonished Cunningham. It set a low altitude speed record of 645 miles per hour at 10,000 feet, easily blasting past the RAF's speed requirements. And then, on April the 9th, 1952, test pilot John Derry and his observer, Tony Richards, took it up to 40,000 feet, pushed the nose into a shallow dive, and went supersonic. In doing so, they became the first crew in aviation history to take a two-seat, twin-engine combat aircraft through the sound barrier. At this point, the future of the DH-110 looked incredibly bright. But de Havilland was about to be dealt not one, but two hammer blows that in most circumstances would have doomed any further development. The first came with the RAF's apparent rejection of the prototypes in favour of the Gloucester G85. On the 7th of July 1952, the Gloucester Javelin was ordered in quantity with super priority production status. The decision to choose the Javelin was driven by the Air Ministry's belief that its delta wing planform offered greater future development potential over the more orthodox swept wing design of the DH-110. But within the Air Ministry itself, this was a very controversial decision, with lines of loyalty essentially being split right down the middle between the DH-110 prototype and the GA5 prototype. As a result, when the second prototype, which was registered Whiskey Golf 240, was completed and flown just a few weeks later, de Havilland had gone from an initial order for 9 aircraft, with potential for serial production, to just 2 prototypes that nobody wanted anymore. It was a disappointment keenly felt by the test pilots, especially as the second prototype was lighter, faster, and even more maneuverable than the first. But hope wasn't completely dead. De Havilland still had time to win back faith in their design. The company prepared to show off their twin-boom interceptor at the prestigious Farnborough Air Show. The team was convinced that a spectacular, public aerial display would surely force the Air Ministry to reconsider their offer and order the DH.110 into production. But on Saturday, September the 6th, 1952, at around 10 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, those dreams were violently and tragically shattered by the second hammer blow. The Farnborough Air Show was a week-long event, and the black-painted second prototype, Whiskey Golf 240, had been doing the display flights all week. But on Saturday morning, it had been grounded with engine trouble. Refusing to disappoint the large Saturday crowd, Derry and Tony Richards jumped into a small light aircraft and flew back to Hatfield. There, they grabbed the first prototype, Whiskey Golf 236, as a substitute, and flew it straight from Hatfield back to the Farnborough Air Show, arriving just in time to start their display slot. Derry climbed the prototype up to 40,000 feet and pushed the big twin-boom fighter down into a supersonic dive aimed straight at the airfield, delighting the crowd by letting off a massive set of double sonic booms. He then leveled out, screamed down along the runway at over 500 miles an hour, and pulled the plane up into a tight, high-G climbing turn to port, and set up for a low-level roll. But as he started to straighten out from that steep vertical banking turn, pointing the aircraft up and towards the airfield, disaster struck. In a fraction of a second, both outer wings failed. The starboard wing went first, followed almost instantly by the port, folding straight up and tearing away. This sudden loss of lift shifted the centre of pressure instantly, pitching the fuselage nacelle upward with frightful violence. The immense G-forces generated by this literally tore the cockpit cabin, the tail booms, and both massive Rolls-Royce Avon engines completely off the airframe. In milliseconds, the entire airframe disintegrated. Carried on by their own forward momentum, the engines flew ahead. One crashed on open ground, but the other plunged directly into a dense crowd of spectators that were sitting on a hillside overlooking the runway. The cockpit section slammed into the ground just short of another crowd of spectators, showering the public with debris. Derry and Richards were, of course, killed instantly, and on the ground, 29 spectators lost their lives, and over 60 were injured, making this the worst airshow disaster in British history. Astonishingly, and despite the absolute horror that was unfolding on the ground, the airshow itself was only halted for a few minutes to let emergency vehicles through, and then the flying program actually continued. Derry's close friend, squadron leader Neville Duke, would take to the air in a prototype Hawker Hunter. He climbed up to 40,000 feet and blasted a double sonic boom over the airfield as a tribute and as a show of professional solidarity. But such a traumatic event obviously could not go unanswered. In its wake, a huge overhaul of airshow safety procedures were brought in. Aerobatic displays from then on were to be kept to a box away from the ground and aligned in such a way that if the engines failed at any point, the aircraft would always fall short of the spectators. Jets were to be kept at least 230 meters from the crowd at all times when flying straight, and 450 meters away when doing any kind of aerial maneuvers. Aircraft had to keep a minimum altitude of 150 meters when performing any section of their aerial display. These restrictions worked, thankfully. For over 6 decades, although crashes would still occur, no member of the public died at a British airshow until the Shoreham Airshow disaster that occurred back in 2015. The question that was being asked at the time, of course, was what had caused the prototype to break up in the first place. Debris, first-hand reports, and recordings of the crash were pored over by the investigators and the engineers at de Havilland at Hatfield. Early theories blamed aerodynamic flutter tearing the tail booms apart, but that was quickly ruled out. Instead, Chief Designer R.E. Bishop eventually found that the wing had failed under a brutal combination of bending and twisting stresses. The root of the problem was de Havilland's reliance on their classic D-nose leading-edge wing structure. I don't have a copy of the original wing structure for the DH.110 prototype, but I do have an example of it from the de Havilland Vampire, so just imagine this, but scaled up a bit. The D-nose was a lightweight and hollow leading-edge section. and it had worked perfectly fine on the lighter, slower, straight-winged de Havilland Vampire and de Havilland Venom. But the structural design completely lacked a front spar to absorb the sheer loads ahead of the main spar. It simply could not handle the massive aerodynamic and structural loads of a heavy, swept-wing transonic aircraft pulling high G forces in a tight turn. In structural testing during the investigation, it was found that the leading edge could suddenly wrinkle and collapse under high torsional stresses. Once that leading edge buckled, the passing airflow peeled back the skin like that of an orange peel, destroying the wing's lift and its structural integrity within milliseconds. This wasn't being experienced in the Vampire and the Venom, but it was being experienced on the DH.110. This was exasperated in the first prototype, Whiskey Golf 236, because it had already flown nearly 125 hours and was structurally more fatigued than the second prototype. It was estimated that at the time of the airshow, the wing only had about 65% of its original design strength. Despite this loss of strength though, the investigations also concluded that had they installed a front spar in the wing, the buckle would never have spread, and WG-236 would probably have survived the turn. Consequently, WG-240, the surviving prototype, was immediately grounded for an intensive and complete redesign of the wing structure. Along with the changes to the spar structure, the outboard wings in general were extensively reinforced, notably by adding a second skin to critical areas of the leading edge to prevent the torsioning buckling that had destroyed Whiskey Golf 236. During the grounding, de Havilland also took the opportunity to make further changes. The vertical control surfaces were altered, and an all-moving tailplane was installed, the first on any British aircraft at the time. To aid with low-speed handling, cambered extensions were added to the wing's leading edge outboard of the wing fences, and the aircraft's ventral fin was slightly reduced in overall size. Following the changes, the second prototype would eventually return to flight testing. The timeline of this is disputed by sources. Some say it would fly again in late spring 1953, others cite the 11th of June 1954. Regardless though, at this point things were looking incredibly bleak for the program. The second prototype was flying again, but it had only been modified to prove initially that the original design flaw of the first prototype could be overcome. If the RAF had little interest before, they had no intention of pursuing the aircraft now, after it had just made headlines for the worst mass casualty event in an airshow on British soil. An upgraded version of the DH.110 was submitted for a new RAF specification, this time to be equipped with more and powerful engines, promising a supposed top speed of Mach 1.4, but once again de Havilland would lose out on this proposal to Gloucester, although this time they likely dodged a bullet as the proposed specification was eventually cancelled in 1956. But for de Havilland and the DH.110, that did seem to be the end of the line. The DH.110 was shaping up to be yet another classic dead-end project of the early Cold War. However, just as the RAF walked away, the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm would come crawling back, throwing the aircraft an unexpected lifeline. But that would also not be the end of its troubles. Oh, far from it. Political and treasury battles, massive redesigns, quality control issues, delayed weapon systems, and a staggering operational accident rate. All of these things, and more, would await the DH.110 as it went through a fairy tale transformation into the de Havilland Sea Vixen that we all know and occasionally love today. But that will be discussed in part 2 of this video. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help to keep this channel going. And just once again, because I'm not going to stop plugging this anytime soon, if you would like to donate to help to get XJ607 back on the road, the link to the GoFundMe is in the video description below and in the pinned comment. I really hope we can raise all the funds for this because I cannot wait for the opportunity to go on the road with this and tour around various museums and air shows because it's a Sea Vixen cockpit, it's cool, and I get to hide in the coal hole if I don't want to talk to people, so you know, win-win. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members. Unfortunately, I've had an issue getting some of the data through for Patreon and YouTube members this month, mostly YouTube. It looks like a couple of people have signed up, but when I'm actually getting the CSV spreadsheets for it, the names aren't updating. So instead of possibly getting the names wrong this week, I will update the spreadsheet next week and hopefully have the Patreon and YouTube member Wing Commander names on that when the next video comes out. Anyway, that is all from me today. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time in part 2. Goodbye.